Okay, you're live.
Thank you. I'll share my screen, Randy, if you want to go ahead and start.
Right. So we're all set. So welcome, everyone. This is a subcommittee meeting on the principal licensure recommendations of PEPSC. And what Kim is showing you, so we have, Tom made a presentation at the last PEPSC meeting. And Tom, thanks very much for including all that information. I have basically taken the information from your presentation and just reorganized it a little bit according to each of the four major questions that were described. And the reasoning being that I think this may offer us a little efficiency in terms of seeing where the three groups that responded, that's the Teacher Recruitment and Retention Task Force, the Principal Advisory Group, and then NCACTE, to see what their recommendations were so we can kind of compare and contrast. And where all this is headed is for us to assemble draft recommendations from this subcommittee, I believe, to go back to PEPSC in the next upcoming meeting. And I want to pause there. Kim, is this all consistent with your understanding and where we're headed today?
That's correct. That's correct.
Yeah, how would we frame the, if I may use the term, the essential question? What is it we're supposedly responding to? I mean, I know what we're responding to, but what is the perpetuating force that created the subcommittee? I think I know, but I'd like to hear it one more time. Why are we doing this?
So Tom, how about if I start us off and then you may have additional information to add in. Based on Tom's presentation at the last PEPSC meeting, we had feedback that came in from these three different groups on four primary areas related to recommendations for principal licensure, for the legislation of principal licensure moving forward. And so as a way for, one of the questions that arose in the last PEPSC meeting was, should PEPSC have a recommendation that would then go forward to the BOE? And so this subcommittee was formed with the intent of putting together a draft recommendation for PEPSC that could be based on the information that was collected so far. So I think that's where we're headed. That's the destination here, is to construct draft PEPSC recommendations on this that could then go back to PEPSC for endorsement, I suppose. And Tom, is there more that would be useful to fill in on that?
I don't think so. One thing I heard, and just want to clarify, you don't have to write draft legislation. I think just the recommendations on these at a conceptual level on these areas would be sufficient. Someone, that go to the boards, their legislative liaisons would take care of drafting the actual legislation.
Great, so thanks, Tom.
I think as long as you're just kind of giving them input on how the state should proceed on those big issues is sufficient.
Thanks, Tom. Dr. Houston, does that address your question?
Yes, thank you.
Great. Before we move forward, are there any other questions from the group? All right, so how I have organized these strategically. So they go from, just in my read of the feedback that was provided, the questions / issues that seem to have the most consensus across the three groups providing input to those to where maybe there was less consensus. So if we start, what Kim has shared the screen, this is a document that I created to just help us organize our thoughts around this. The first one has to do with the licensure exam. And Tom, this is coming directly out of your slides. We see that all three groups did not support a licensure exam. Two of the groups provided recommendations in there around supporting more performance-based or portfolio-based assessment systems, but not a formal sit-down exam. I'd like to open it up to the group. If you have recommendations on, from our subcommittee perspective, what would be a draft recommendation coming from us? And I'll add in that Van, I believe if you're on the call here, in our last PEPSC meeting had noted that there was pretty good consensus across this one, so this one might be an easy one.
So this is Marcy. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Marcy. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. I'm wondering. I think that the consensus around not having an exam would be the recommendation. I guess the question here is about the portfolio-based assessment system, which is really part of the next one, and I can't see the full agenda. So if we could get a link to the agenda or a copy of that, that would help. But I think that it would be up to the programs to determine what that, because right now, most of the full-time MSA or all the full-time MSA all have the portfolio assessment as part of it. It's just the add-on programs, as I understand it, that may not have the full portfolio assessment. So I feel like those two are the recommendation for those would align in that we would, in lieu of an exam, a standardized exam, require the performance-based assessment for all programs that would lead to a recommendation for licensure. Does that make any sense at all?
Yeah, it does to me. Sam Houston speaking. I'm a performance-based guy. I think there's probably, and I don't know, Tom probably does, but I don't know the deep research on that. But my guess is that performance measures more accurately identify the qualities and characteristics of the candidate than a paper and pencil test. I mean, I believe we're in an era where we're seeing a lot of different university issues and others moving away from a test, recognizing that long term it doesn't carry the power of validity to performance. So, you know, if we're going to use a measure that may best predict how young people or young administrators are going to do, would-be, wannabe administrators are going to do, I think performance measures for me would be, and it sounds like maybe the group felt that way, would be the best way to go.
Yeah, Randy, I agree with what Sam just said. Performance, I'm looking at the two cells. A performance-based assessment could be a component of a portfolio. So a portfolio doesn't, sort of not one or the other. But ultimately, the most important information we would have about a potential program completer is what is the evidence that they can perform in the role that we're looking for.
Yeah, thank you all. So I'm wondering, do we want to use, within the recommendation that we take back to PEPSC for review, do we want to, it sounds like part of this is that we don't recommend having a licensure exam. It's hard to find the right language because nowadays it's not even paper pencil, right? Everything's on computer and
right.
A sit down exam is still another thing. But so we're in consensus that we recommend that it not be a formal exam. Do we want to use the term performance, some form of a performance-based assessment? And to Van's point, that there's a little bit of a difference between a portfolio and a performance-based assessment. Those what one can be part of a portfolio, but they're not necessarily the same thing. So are we comfortable with using the term performance-based assessment?
Dr. Bedfield,
Yes, sir.
this is Tom Tomberlin. May I make a comment?
Please.
So I think this is a great question because it's raising in my mind, and I'm sure it will of board members, is this something separate and apart from a portfolio-based portfolio? So our understanding is that most MSA programs do a portfolio, but those aren't standardized across the state. They really don't factor into a licensure requirement. They are a program requirement, I think, for most of your MSA programs, but in terms of recommending the license. So if you're talking about a performance-based assessment system, I think we need to make sure that we're very clear that that's separate and apart. Could be a part of, but it is something other than the portfolio that EPPs use with their MSA programs. And if that performance-based assessment system is being used as a condition of the license, then it would, by necessity, be required to be uniform across the state.
Exactly. I thought I was just having the portfolio design can be as personal as an institution wants it to be. But the performance measures would need to be uniform for anyone offering the licensure or the degree. So is it performance, is it portfolio and performance-based, or is a part of the portfolio the standardized performance instrument, whatever that instrument might be? Using the word standardized and performance is kind of a redundancy, I suppose, but I hope you understand what I'm trying to say, that we ought to have, if we're going to have a performance measure that has anything to do with licensure, it needs to be the same design across all institutions.
Yeah, I understand, Dr. Houston. Thanks for that point. Tom, I'm curious, is this pulling us beyond the realm of our current charge at this point? Or is it, by raising this, can it be fruitful to come back to PEPSC with this subcommittee, discuss this, and based on the membership of this subcommittee, we saw the value in including, further exploration of, or whatever that language might be, of a standardized performance-based assessment?
I personally, and this is just Tom and his experience with the board, I think it's going to be in your interest to make a recommendation that you support some kind of assessment, and a performance-based assessment sounds like a really good alternative. I think you're going to have less success with the board just saying, don't have a licensure exam. So I don't think it's beyond your scope to actually make a recommendation to modify what it is we expect our principals to do in pursuit of the license. I think this is a really good idea. If this is what, let me make sure I'm being clear. It's a really good idea to offer the alternative to a standardized test, whether it's a performance-based assessment or not. That's up to y'all. But I think it is a good idea to offer something in lieu of, rather than simply request that principals not have to take any kind of assessment.
Tom, to be an assistant principal, do you have to have any credential other than someone decided to name you an assistant principal?
Yes, you have to hold either a principal license or a provisional principal's license. So
Okay.
if you're currently enrolled in an MSA program, the state will issue you a provisional principal's license. You cannot
And
be
the
a
reason-
sitting principal with a provisional license. You have to have a clear license to be the principal of a school, but you can be an AP with a provisional license.
Yeah, the reason I ask that is we have so many efforts out there now to accelerate the whole process of getting people into the principalship from the assistant role. I just wasn't clear what the guidelines are now about that, so thank you.
Hey, Tom, to follow up on the point that you just made, let me try something and see if this is what you're saying. That recommendation 1 could be discontinue the use of licensure exams as part of the process. Recommendation 2, in lieu of the licensure exam, require a performance-based assessment system, and we finish out that sentence. And then recommendation 3 could be that the performance-based assessment is a component of a portfolio. Of course, we'd have to determine what else would go in that portfolio. Are you saying leave the licensure exam in but have an alternative? Or if you say it has to go, you have to articulate what we replace it with?
I think the latter is what I'm saying.
Good.
I don't think anybody's especially married to the idea of like a praxis exam. I think there is interest in ensuring that whoever we grant the principal license to has done some, we have some kind of assessment of their skills to hold that position.
Thanks, Tom, on that. Van, I appreciate the way you laid that out. Marcy, I'm curious, any other thoughts on this?
No, I'm just following along. I know it's not our responsibility to try to look specifically at what a performance-based assessment would look like. And being very specific, thank you, Tom, the portfolio word, we used to always refer to that as the P word. We weren't able to say it for the longest time out loud. So I don't know, my mind can't get wrapped fully around it without seeing it. Without knowing more about what it would look like. But I do agree that it's not in our best interest to recommend absence of any type of assessment, but I just don't know what it's going to look like. Having been in the teaching role at the university, teaching in an MSA program, only in one program, of course, I don't know what the others all look like. It's hard to imagine that, given the courses that these students are completing and taking.
Well, tell me what you mean by that, Marcy.
Well, the flexibility that the universities have about the courses that are offered and how they're structured and how they're taught, different professors teach them differently. They all teach the standards. The current portfolio, and I know we're not talking about that, the portfolio that they currently complete in most of the programs, as I understand it, and what the one I taught in several years ago, was standardized and aligned to the standards. It was aligned to the standards established in their evaluation. So it was easier, even though we all taught it differently. We taught the same cohorts of students. We taught the content differently. They all in the end created this one document masterpiece that was aligned to the standards of the profession that were outlined by the state board. So there was a measurement tool. But that again, even if it's performance-based, you can't do that as part of a program. The performance piece has to come when they're actually living in that world.
Right.
So is that part of something that will happen as part of an internship versus when they're doing their coursework, which is when they're doing their portfolios now? I don't know, that's just where my head is going. So sorry, I probably took this down a very
No.
different path.
My vision, I don't know exactly what the universities do anymore. I'm not sure anybody knows what they all do. But at the same time, my vision was that the performance would be identified when they're out doing their, the practicum, if that's the right word, when they're out in school, when they're in an assignment. Someone would be looking for indicators relevant to whatever that tool would look like. Impossible to do in the classroom, and impossible to measure on an exam. So, a tool would have to be designed and even some training done where these interns are. So I hope we're going to make a recommendation that would lead to finding the answers to the kinds of questions you proposed by another committee, not us.
Thanks, Sam. That's what, Kim, I want to make sure, are you getting these notes?
Yes, I just wanted to listen to everything before I started writing it down.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to make sure I wasn't leaving us in a bad place if I wasn't writing everything down. All right, so.
We're recorded on it, Kim.
Oh, that's true, yeah.
Yes, we are. You're right.
Okay, good.
So Van, the way you laid it out is to discontinue the use of the licensure exam being an initial recommendation, and then in lieu of the licensure exam to have a performance-based assessment. I think we've had the beginnings of a conversation that this is a whole nother thing, figuring out what that assessment would be like. And then that, Sam, as you pointed out, right, that can be the work of others in the future figuring that out. And then Van, you also listed the third one, that the performance-based assessment be a component of a portfolio. And is everyone on board to have that as well be part of the recommendation?
I am. I vote for it.
Marcy, how do you feel about that one?
I'm good with that.
Okay. Van, you're still good with that?
Yeah, it's just the second bullet, I was going to offer an extension. I think we'll see how people feel about it. I think we should be specific in saying, in lieu of exam requirement, have performance-based assessments situated in a school setting. This is not a virtual thing. This is not using technology tools to simulate a setting. It's in a setting.
Right.
What was the piece from Dr. Houston I should add?
Relevant to what, Kim?
I thought there was something else I should add to the notes from you, Dr. Houston, that Dr. Penfield mentioned.
I concur. I just think again that I don't have a problem with the performance-based instrument being a part of some other document that leads to showing some completion of program. And I like what Van said, in a school setting.
Okay,
So,
okay.
yeah, no,
Okay,
I'm
so
fine.
it's all inclusive there. Okay. Thank you.
Any other discussion of this one? All right, let's move along to the next one then. So the next one pertained to whether the MSA, the Masters of School Administration, in and of itself is to be required. And where the rubber meets the road on this one is that for many of our IHEs, we have, and we're one of them here at Greensboro, there is an add-on licensure. So you can have a master's in another area, but you complete the add-on certificate program to give you that add-on licensure. And currently, the language of the legislation would have to be changed to allow for that. So what we see is that across the three groups providing input, the first one, the Teacher Recruitment and Retention Task Force, agreed on the MSA, and I will point out that I didn't see in Tom's notes that there was actually any input on not being in support of an add-on licensure in combination with a master's in another area. So that one seemed a little unclear for me. The other two groups, I think were pretty consistent, it seemed like, from Tom's notes, that they did support the idea of having an add-on licensure for individuals who had a master's in another area. So with that, let me open it up to the group to hear your thoughts on recommendations.
So we had followed up about the alternative path of an add-on, and that is something that, because I had to leave that meeting early, so I did ask and follow up, and I think that what was agreed to is that the add-on would continue to be a viable option. It just needs to be more comprehensive to include all of the and the word just left me, but all of the same components that the full program offers. I think, Tom, if you want to correct me if I'm wrong, but there are some that are abbreviated because they already hold a master's in another area. So the add-on program, there may be every single component or competency may not be the same as the full program.
Yes, Dr. Holland, Dr. Seiberg worked with the programs, and the general overview yielded the finding that these licensure-only programs were not more intensive in that they covered all the standards in a shorter period of time, but were truncated. So they were making decisions about which of the standards they would not be requiring their participants to take coursework in, and so that was a bit of a concern to us. The idea of if you hold another master's, I mean, just from a personal question and this is for the EPP folks on the call. So I have a master's degree in classical studies. So what is the assumption that master's degree is giving me that I don't need to learn certain things about the standard course for an MSA program? Or is the situation that the EPPs are doing an analysis of the coursework that was involved in the current masters and seeing how that substitutes for aspects of the MSA program.
I don't know that, I hear your questions and appreciate them. I don't know that I, off the top of my head, have all the answers to that. I do think that there is an issue where oftentimes the master's is in an education-related area. So it may be in a curricular area, right? And that, and through the experience the individual has had, contributes considerably to the competencies underlying the licensure. To your point, though, what if the master's is in a more distal area? Then what? So I don't have an answer to that. I'm wondering, Van, do you have more insight into that?
I think most of our licensure only students have a master's degree that's in education or a related field. I mean, that's sort of the higher ed escape route is related field. As far as the professional standards that we would expect a school leader to meet, whether they came through licensure only or a master's in school administration, they should be able to meet the same standards. The university or the college is layering into an MSA, we would assume, things that exceed the requirements for licensure, because if they didn't, why would a person just get licensure only? They'd just go ahead and get a master's, because it in essence would be the same thing. So I'm sitting back in Tom's comments. To me, Randy, the first block that we looked at with the performance assessment, the portfolio, to me, that's the critical question. You can come through licensure only, you can come through MSA, you can come with another master's degree, but at the end of this, you got to be able to exhibit your capacity to perform in the artifacts that are in a portfolio that allow you to become a school administrator. Tom, I appreciate your example, and it is a wide field that you could have an MFA or you could have a master's in education, and both of those count.
So, Van, I appreciate that, because the speaking to the outcomes rather than the inputs does resonate with me. So, yes, if you can hold, Tom Tomberlin's useless degree in classical languages and still become a principal, but whatever you do for that preparation has to yield you've got to demonstrate that you've got the skills and competencies required to do so. I really like that position.
And the purpose of the master's, in some arguments, is to reflect having acquired advanced learning in a field. So the master's degree is evidence of that. If you sort of think about this in philosophical language about professions, we want to see that evidence of having been a learner in an advanced space. Probably we prefer that it was an MSA, but I don't know that it's practical to do that, and I don't even know that it's something I think you're right. I think if the person if they have their master's in whatever, and they can get to the outcomes we're looking for in terms of practice, they met what the state of North Carolina needs.
Thanks for that discussion, everyone. And Van, I appreciate you pulling us back to that assessment part and the competencies that would underline that assessment. That at the end of the day, that's the link. So I guess I'm curious, just in terms of moving us forward on this one, is there a sentiment amongst the group that we put forth a recommendation that, and we'd have to get the wording on this, but that a master's is required, and that master's could be an MSA, but it could also be a master's in another area in combination with the add-on licensure.
Am I
Someone
muted? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you guys hear me? You can?
Yes. Yeah, please go ahead, Sam.
Okay. I never know when I'm muted or not. I think that's an interesting question, and it is very pertinent to the discussion. Some of the better school administrators I know were music majors, or were maybe classical languages, but they had certainly demonstrated their ability to act as a learner and had performed on whatever measures were necessary to get a master's degree in a particular discipline or performance area. I think that has value. I don't know how, again, you guys at the university level look at that, but if they then can get an assistant, a provisional and an assistant principal's role and meet performance standards, I think they should be considered for licensure, regardless of their undergraduate and master's study.
So to that point, should we recommend an assistant principal licensure area versus the one principal licensure area? Should there be an AP license area?
This is Tom. My sense on that is yes, but I think that's the next round of work for PEPSC. Once you get through the teacher licensure and compensation system, we're going to be coming back to you to work on administrators. That's the next group that's teed up. So I think it's the right direction. I think it's maybe too early. But I mean, you could go ahead and set the groundwork for creating that kind of recommendation.
Thanks, Tom. So Kim, I'm wondering about a concise recommendation on this that perhaps acknowledges the importance of the MSA. So I'm thinking of language that says something to the effect of requires a master's of school administration or a master's in, we want to say, in a education and or related discipline, along with an add-on licensure. I'm wondering if someone has some wordsmithing to that.
I thought that sounded pretty good. The reason I say that is it really doesn't matter what wordsmithing we do. What I believe our recommendations will do is to generate further discussion, and the right words will flow sooner or later.
Randy, the or related discipline troubles me. So a person who has a master's in chemistry, works in the industry for 10 years, decides they want to be a teacher, comes out, gets certification, teaches for 10 years, and decides they want to be a principal. Their chemistry is not a related discipline. By some judgments. I just, from a policy point of view, related discipline seems nearly unenforceable. Or it's going to drive people at DPI crazy trying to enforce it. So I appreciate the intent of it, but I think require a master's degree.
So just leave it at require a master's degree.
Yeah, I think it's either in education or we don't name it at all. I think when we get into middle ground, it just opens up all kinds of ambiguity.
And then I think that by saying in education creates all kinds of ambiguity because it can be really ambiguous sometimes,
Yeah.
right? As to where that degree came from and is it in education or isn't it?
Yeah.
So do we just say require a master's degree? And if the master's degree is not a master's of school administration, then it must be accompanied by an add-on licensure?
Well, if it's not an MSA, they have to have the add-on licensure.
Right.
That's
Right, I agree. I think the recommendation there is that requires a master's of school administration or a completed add-on program if they hold a master's degree in another field. Isn't that what we've agreed to? I mean, isn't that what we discussed? Sorry.
Marcy, that's consistent with my understanding. And I think Kim's getting it down and just breaking it down into 2 points here.
Kim, you probably need to add the requirement on like we're not holding an MSA, but holding a master's in another field. You got to have a master's is the anchor point.
Thanks, everyone. Any other discussion on this one?
Oops, sorry.
That's
Not me.
You're good, Sam. Marcy?
Yes.
Yes, I'm good.
All right. Kim, how about if we go down to the next one?
Okay.
All right. So this is the year-long internship component. All three groups supported the year-long internship. Some gave more detailed input on what that should look like. So one thing for us to think about is how much of those considerations we'd like to include in our recommendation. I'd like to open it up to the group for any input you have at this point.
Is the question yes or no?
I
Longer,
think Sam,
shorter?
yeah, I mean, I think Sam, it could be yes or no, and then what, if yes, then what does it look like? How long, how short?
Well, I would support at least a year long. Particularly if it's going to lead to a generation of performance indicators met to satisfy getting the full license. I don't know how you could do it fairly any more quickly than that. Because there's also should be a period of time that they're being guided and mentored through that year so that they can, be ready for the principalship. If it becomes nothing more than somebody else to look after the buses and discipline and, do the mundane things the principal doesn't want to do, that's not an internship, in my opinion, and should not satisfy any performance-based instrument that should be leading to that internship. So I don't know the rest of the answers, but I think at minimum a full year.
So can I speak a little bit?
And I actually mean 12 months.
You do mean 12?
There are other things that leadership does at school level beyond the student calendar year that need to be understood.
Thanks, Sam. Marcy, you had follow-up on that?
Yeah, I think we need to be very careful about requiring, I don't know that I can support 12 months, and I will say why. One, positions are not allotted to school districts by 12 months. And so you're going to create another scenario of haves versus have-nots, or a greater divide between what's perceived to be the haves versus the have-nots. Your less wealthy, smaller districts will not be able to support those individuals for 12 months. Unless the state is going to come up and pay all of them for a 12-month internship. And I don't know the answer to that. But I think that some of the points on this agenda that we have about it being, year-long in terms of 10 months and the 1,000 hours, I can support. If you think about it, a full-time person in the finance world gets calculated based on 2,080 hours a year. 1,000 hours of contact time is half of that. So at 10 months, it's not unreasonable to expect that a full-time person would get more than that if it's a full-time released intern, and a part-time person should be able to accomplish 1,000 hours. And I agree with supporting the idea of it not being a August to May kind of thing, which would get to Dr. Houston's point about the things that happen when you close a school and open a school. If there were some, maybe it's a January to December, so that they get that closing and opening period. Maybe it's shifted and it starts sooner in their program. And again, I know I'm going way out in left field, but just from a practitioner standpoint, knowing what we see with our interns, we have a lot in our district because we're large. I think where some of us struggle, and I personally don't support this, we have interns that don't finish their internship now because they get hired and they get a provisional assistant principal license to finish out a school year. And that doesn't sit well with me, but I don't get to make that decision either. So we support the recommendations when they come through, and by support, I mean process. I think that it needs to be more structured in how the universities are permitting these internships. But 12 months is going to be hard financially on a lot of districts and on people for that to work and be successful.
Thanks, Marcy. Is anyone opposed to us having as the starting place for the recommendation to require a year-long internship, and then we can define specifics around that? So recommendation starts with requiring a year-long internship. Can I take the group to the 1,000-hour requirement? In the feedback we got, the principal advisory group did say 1,000 hours. And the hour thing, the quantification of duration through hours, I suppose, can also be advantageous for those who are in a part-time role as well, because you can then spread that time out. And CACT came back with 300 to 500 hours, which is dramatically lower. And I'm just curious from the group, I have heard 1,000 hours can be challenging, and I don't know why, Marcy, based off of what you had just communicated. So to the group, do you all, Marcy, I'm hearing from you that 1,000 hours is a good amount of time. Are there others that feel that other timeframes should be entertained as well?
Where does the 1,000 hours come from? Is that in some guideline now?
No, sir, it is not.
You know, maybe our recommendations can lead to redefining what it means to be in process. And Marcy makes a great point: opening and closing school and the things you have to do in between. If you don't experience those and you end up getting a principalship, they can be debilitating and can cause a whole lot of an individual to make a lot of mistakes. So that was just my thought. See the whole picture before anybody then starts to say, and what would you do under these conditions, if that's a performance measure that they're looking to see evidence of.
We could also, the recommendation could remain silent on some of this stuff at this point in time.
Randy, I've just been calculating arithmetic. A 1,000-hour internship is the equivalent of 125 business days, which is the equivalent of 25 business weeks, which means in a 12-month period, this intern is spending 50% of their time being an intern, which means they're not spending 50% of their time being whatever they were. I think Marcy's the one who raised the point earlier about this is not a cheap proposition for the person who makes the choice. I'm sort of, we're asking a lot of the individual in the absence of defined resources. And so when you get to the required long internship, I like the minimum language that you got to be at least this many hours spread out over that 12. But the internship, it's about the structure of the internship as much as it is the length of the internship and the amount of time. So that internship has got to include the structural components that allow the person, number one, to engage in the performance assessment, and number two, to produce the portfolio. And so what are we saying has to happen during the internship beyond minimum, maximum numbers of hours and minimum, maximum numbers of weeks? I mean, to me, that's the way to frame it. We expect the internship to include these components. It's got to last at least this long. It cannot exceed this long. And then the institutions structure that internship within those parameters. But it's all, back to Tom's comment earlier, it's about the outcomes. What are we expecting them to show us they can do?
I agree with that, and I really like the idea of having it needs to be no less than this should be no more than this and should include these components, because in our district and a few other districts in the state, we have year-round schools. So it may actually give universities or program administrators the opportunity to create a class for folks to run their internship from a March to September timeframe. You could run a class between semesters. I don't know, it would be kind of creative to do it that way, and that would get to what we call closing and opening a school. And folks that currently do it part-time during the school year, a lot of times, or originally, were choosing not to do full-time internships because of finances. If they chose to still not do that during the school year and they stayed in their classroom position, they could possibly do their internship during the summer in a year-round school, and it wouldn't impact their traditional calendar position. So there'd be maximum flexibility with respect to that as well for individuals to have full-time experiences in the summer with year-round schools. I think the 1,000 hours came back to, there was some research or some information that came to us that other states were requiring that in their internships. I can't remember where that came from, but it may have even been through Eddie Price and the TP3 folks at one point. 1,000 hours came up. And there was some legislation a few years ago about requiring minimum hours. I don't know if it actually came to fruition or not.
Dan, to your point of thinking through, what are the competencies underlying the internship itself? What does a successful internship look like? To me, that seems like that's now a whole new area, and I guess I'm wondering whether to what extent we're positioned to include any details of that in a recommendation, or could a recommendation come forth that these details need to be hammered out?
Yeah, I agree, Randy. I think the thing I'm searching for in the language is, it is as much or more about exhibiting the standards of practice than it is clock and calendar. I'm not saying clock and calendar matter because you got to see the ability to sustain it over time. But the internship, in my mind, the internship should be built around the ability for the candidate to exhibit the standards of practice we're looking for. And I like the idea of saying that over a 12-month cycle of a school, we're expecting that internship to include certain kinds of experiences. And then maybe we leave that to another group to determine that. But to me, I think as much as we can stay focused on the standards of practice, the evidence, the portfolio, the performance assessment, that will give people guidance as to what the purpose of the internship is. Versus it's 1,000 hours, it's 36 weeks, it's those kinds of, at least relying solely on that.
Thanks, Van.
A teacher internship, by the way, typically, teacher education internship, typically, if they're full-time all the time in their internship, it's about 650 hours given, give or take, depending on how you count hours. But, that's what we expect traditionally for a teacher education intern.
Dr. Penfield, this is Tom Tomberlin.
Yes, sir.
So I do want to clarify something here, that you folks are not really making, this is kind of unusual in that you're not making a policy recommendation. You're making recommendations for how the board itself will make recommendations to the General Assembly about how this principle, the statutes regarding principal licensure should be changed. So I don't think there's any, it's a little odd for what we do, because there will be other groups advocating for other positions, if that makes sense. And so I think to where you can make your recommendation as coherent as possible is, I think you should go for it. I mean, and I think this is one area where it could this one and the teaching experience is going to be a challenge for you. And I think whatever you have to do to kind of flesh that out so that folks understand where you're going and what you're trying to achieve would be really helpful. Because in the end, it may not look anything like what you've recommended. Because, you know, the General Assembly is going to do what the General Assembly is going to do. But to the extent that you can make this a really well thought out recommendation to them, I think that's going to serve this group well. And I'm double booked today, so I have to jump off, if that's okay.
Thanks, Tom. We appreciate it.
No, you can't go. Yeah, I don't know the answer to this. It'd be a whole lot easier if you were working backwards and you had a performance design. You could kind of calculate the likelihood of them having that experience. As Marcy said, would be a summer experience, calendar year wise. I think we just should search for, even if it does say, find a way to support these, support the whole process as a 12-month, a full year effort. That doesn't mean because the support's not there right now, they could not become a part of that. The General Assembly, you can never, anybody thinks they can second guess the General Assembly just hadn't been around very long. But we have a critical shortage of not just principals, but principals that are actually qualified. And seemingly handwriting on the wall is going to get worse, and it's going to get become even a deeper and deeper problem in our more difficult schools to staff. So, as Tom said, we're not making a recommendation. I think we're making a recommendation for somebody to make a recommendation, and we all just put out there what we think. We shouldn't try to guess will it happen or not.
Yeah, thanks, Sam. So in the interest of time, I know there's been a lot of ideas floated around. I wonder if we can just get down on paper some of the key ideas that have surfaced based on this. And I also think we're largely informed by the input that we've received from these other three groups. So I'm just reiterating some of the ones that I've heard. It sounds like having a range of time first, that whether we use the term year-long in there, and then for it to consist of a range of time. It sounds like the time that we're talking about here is somewhere like no less than 300 to 500 hours, and this is based off of very little info, and then up to 1,000 hours. And Van, I'm channeling your comment here that maybe it's better just to have the lower threshold there. Anyone feeling that we should an advantage to giving a range versus just a lower value? a lower threshold?
I don't think you're gonna have a problem on the high end if we don't have it there, because the program is gonna have a hard time recruiting if they go
Right.
1,000 hours. But it doesn't, I don't think it hurts to say it.
All right.
Are we saying anything about the number of semesters, or we're just going by hours?
One thing we could do is that could get at that, Kim, is, and this is going back to some of the language that Van was using, is to say that the internship, shall touch on or lead to, the candidate exhibiting standards of practice. Van, totally using your language here, standards of practice that would be characteristic throughout a school year. So it could leave open whether it is 2 semesters or spans the summer, but it gets it back to the standards of practice throughout the school year. So I just pose that as one option that makes it a little more ambiguous, and maybe that's not the right way to go.
I just hope we make the duration appropriate to the desired outcomes. We don't put enough time in there. We can maybe realistic already. We can already understand they probably won't have the experiences we want them to have. So I don't know the answer as to how long, what the window of opportunity might be. But I believe the bottom line is to do what we want to be sure they get the right experiences. How long that is, I don't know. And is it the same amount of time to every one of them? So I like your idea of presenting a range. I just have no idea what the parameters of that range might be. I can't answer that part.
Randy and Kim, where you have the, following what Sam just said, duration and components appropriate to the desired performance outcomes. So performance outcomes are tied to, for example, opening and closing school. Obviously, you got to do part of your internship during opening. So, the educational administration folks could identify what are those critical elements of a school year, of the cycle of a school year, and the performances have to occur, in those critical moments.
Thanks, Van. That does seem to give it a path to address some of these things. Marcy, are anything that you're seeing that you'd like us to include in here that is not already in there?
No, I'm comfortable with what's been suggested.
Right. How about, I'm just aware of time, we're at 1:10, and this last one I know is really important. Moving down to teaching experience, there was a little bit of a range across the groups. And what if we just jump right in? I'm curious to hear from y'all what you're thinking on this one and what an initial position could be.
So I don't have any, I think that there needs to be a minimum. I support a minimum of 4. But I think it needs to be more explicit that it's in their licensure area of either a classroom teacher or the student services support, the instructional. So what the General Assembly refers to as instructional support and the licensure information is support per student services. for counselors, social workers, those type of folks. So,
So Marcy, then do you mean 4 years of school experience rather than calling it teaching experience?
I think we've got to be more explicit than that, because I get every question under the sun. We've had some that have been instructional assistants for a period of time, a parent liaison, which is a non-cert position. So I think it needs to be the experience in their licensed field. Does that help?
Thanks, Marcy. That makes sense to me.
How do we say this so we avoid this problem if we need to? A person who comes in on a clinical residency contract could hold that status for 3 years. And would they then be eligible to begin principal licensure program?
Can you say that one more time?
So-
I lost something.
A person who's a clinical resident could be hold that status for 3 years. And so technically at the end of that, which is the period they've been they've been preparing to be a teacher, they're completing the licensure for teachers, they could then the next week start a principal licensure program. And would that be okay?
So if we go with 4 years as our recommendation, they'd have at least one more year, presumably, after they complete their residency program. But then you could also have, now that I think about it, in that term, if someone starts on a permit to teach, and they teach a year, and then they convert to an emergency license because they've got 18 hours for the second year, and then they convert to a residency license for 3 years, in the middle of that residency program, and we're only requiring 4 years, we're only recommending, and let's assume that it becomes 4 years. In the middle of a residency program, they could start an MSA program. I don't know how folks feel about that. I don't know if it needs to be 4 years of experience on an IPL. Or they must have converted after 4 years to a CPL. I don't know.
Yeah, that 3 years of teaching gets used in a lot of decision-making like this. And 3 years of teaching 25 or 30 years ago was a fairly standard experience. It's not standard anymore.
It is not. And 4 years gets used because, well, currently 3 years is the magic for contract law. Before 4 years, of course, was tenure. So those year, and then 3 years also is for the beginning teacher support program for them to be able to convert from an IPL to a CPL. So 3 and 4, those ranges are pretty comfortable for us. Presumably you would know that person's work after 3 to 4 years because you're making employment decisions about them and licensure decisions about them at that point. But there are some concerns. I mean, we could have people on an alternative licensure path for up to 5 years now, or even longer, because residency, you have to finish within a 5-year window if you drop out and then go back. So it could be longer, it could be up to 8 years. But that too then goes back to the universities or the programs screening their candidates for admission and determining whether or not they would accept them into a program. And I don't know that that's part of what we're here to discuss.
I'm just looking through the language that's here, everyone. The intent here is to allow for a pathway for individuals to enter the principalship for those who have been teachers or for those who have been holding other roles within the school, and not any role, but particular roles related, such as counselors or social workers. Is that consistent with your understanding?
Hey guys, I can't contribute to this particular issue. 3 years or 4 years is 3 years or 4 years, whatever. If what you're trained or licensed to do that's giving you that opportunity counts as that prerequisite, I don't know. I have no input whatsoever that would contribute positively or negatively to that issue.
So I think the original question was in legislation. It speaks to classroom teaching. So I think to that point, you're correct in that it's really to open this up to allow teachers and instructional support personnel, student services personnel, however you want to call them, label them, the opportunity to do this. And then it was originally in the legislation, what's currently in legislation is 4 years. And is that part of the question, is that too much or too little?
I guess what I'm wondering about, that's helpful. Thank you, Marcy. What I'm wondering about is Dan's point earlier is it seems like if it's 3 or 4 years as a teacher, then that's certainly one pathway in. And then if that's not where you had your experience, then what are viable pathways in? And I think this was the point that Van was getting at, is how do we define what that other bucket entails? And does the experience have to be within these other particular licensed areas? I look to you all for your input. I don't have a lot of information informing that from my vantage point.
And Randy, I don't have a strong feeling about this. Now, I know in higher ed, when we hire faculty, we see the 3 years of experience a lot, and I think it's fairly uninformative. But that's different than what we're trying to apply here. And to me, what I'm struggling with the residency part is, if you're going to be an instructional leader and a school leader, you've got to know the context and the practices you're trying to lead. And if you're 90 days removed from learning it yourself, you've just acquired that as a teacher, for example, and then you turn right around and now I'm going to start, learning how to be a principal. But I don't know how to parse it. I mean, I guess I'm struggling with, what do we do? How do you parse it?
Is this something we have to solve right here, or is this something we can leave to another group to solve?
Yeah. I mean, our recommendation could be years of experience sufficient to, whatever. We don't need to name a number. We just say there needs to be enough professional experience to enter the program.
Yeah, I think where we got into some, I agree. I think that what we have is probably sufficient to move us forward. There were some individuals, and we have one in Wake, and it still baffles me. The person didn't have classroom teaching, didn't even have 3 years of classroom teaching experience and got accepted into a program. And so his license can't right now be issued fully. And it's complicated because he also hasn't taken the test for the teaching area that's on his license. That's a whole other issue. But I think that what we have recommended there now is sufficient for this particular topic. When the competencies and everything else are worked out, it'll flesh itself out.
I don't care who the person is, of course, but under what rationale? I'm assuming a university accepted that person into a program. Clearly
Yes.
clearly not meeting any of the standards for acceptance. What rationale has been used to allow that?
I would rather not.
Okay.
It
All right.
started out as a provisional license, and it was something that, again, one of those things that I don't get a vote on. But it has been very challenging since that time, because now that that's not happened and my team supports licensure, I've had to be the bearer of bad news to this employee, and tell him, you got to go back and teach for a while. You got to go back and teach, and you got to pass your test. So,
Dr. Penn, oh,
Yeah.
sorry.
no, I'm done. I'm done. Thank you, Kim.
Sure. Dr. Penfield, did you want to review what the recommendations were?
Can we go through these?
Sure.
So first one related to the licensure exam. Recommendations, 3 parts. Discontinue licensure exam requirement. In lieu of the exam requirement, have performance-based assessment, school setting, and then that performance-based assessment is to be included as a piece of the portfolio. Moving on to the MSA, we had 2 parts to this recommendation, that we require a master's of school administration degree or a master's in another field. Second part is that if the master's is in another field, that we require an add-on licensure component. For the year-long internship, recommendations is to require the year-long internship with the specification that the time range be on the low end somewhere between 300 and 500 hours and up to 1,000 hours on the high end, and that the duration and components would be appropriate to the desired performance outcomes for the year-long internship. And then lastly, with respect to teaching experience, that there be 4 years of experience with licensure areas for certified personnel in a school setting. And this includes teachers and support service personnel, which would include counselors and social workers. Are there any edits to that anyone would like to recommend? Kim, is the next step that this would be on the agenda for the next PEPSC meeting for us to present to PEPSC?
That is correct. And I was proposing to PDF this Word document and attach it as is. And then I was also proposing that you would present it during the PEPSC meeting.
That sounds great to me.
Okay.
Kim, thanks for your help in getting all the ideas down. Does anyone have any other comments, questions, considerations before we sign off?
Thank you, Randy.
Good job.
Thank
You're
you.
welcome. Yeah, thank you all for your input. I really appreciate it. Kim, thanks again.
Sure.
And have a great day, everyone.
Thanks. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Take care.
Bye.
Jim, we're good.